One, we're recording. Hey everybody, today I'm here with Jacob, who is the author of Thought Experiment in the December edition of The Void. Jacob, how's it going?
Going pretty well. When people ask me that nowadays, I tell them I'm doing quarantine okay. So,
That is about as good as we can hope for at this point, right? It just all words have changed meaning since COVID-19.
yeah, that's that's true. I mean, I didn't know what a coronavirus was, and I kind of still wish I didn't. Um, but here we are. I've been learning so much.
Absolutely. And so just to start, I mean, Thought Experiment's a interesting piece. It's dense. It's postmodern in a lot of ways, very experimental, very interesting. Lots of places we could start on it. I'm not exactly sure where to pick. So if what if you had to say something about the piece, what would you say? Anything at all? What's your favorite part? What's most interesting? What inspired you? Whatever you want to say about it.
Yeah, I wrote this it was a kind of creative writing class. It was like right before the pandemic started in the creative writing class in college. And it was kind of an interesting process because I mean, what we did was we had like smaller groups of people, and then the whole class kind of looked at it at the end. Um, and I got a lot of feedback from people telling me they didn't understand what was going on. I think I remember my favorite piece of feedback I got on it was one person said, um, was it, I didn't understand this piece, but not in the way that you intended or something. Uh, and I kind of like that actually, because I think the thing that most what I'm aiming for when I'm writing things is I want to make people feel something, um, and confusion is as good as anything. And if it makes people confused enough that they get upset over it, then I think I've done something right. And yeah, I think it was intended to be that kind of piece. You're not supposed to totally understand what's going on. So if you read it and put it down and were just reflecting on what meaning even means afterwards, then I clearly did something right.
Yeah, it's great. Right, there's lots of authors and lots of pieces, right, that kind of the goal is not always right. The goal is sometimes in the generation of thought in the reader, not in the actual like making a not to say like it doesn't make a cogent point, but like the point it's making is almost secondary to the like need to, as you said, like inspire something in the reader or make the reader fear something or force you to like think about it and reread it and for it to stick in your brain. And I personally like love that kind of writing. I think the piece is really interesting and I think it does do that really well. And obviously as the author of that piece, you don't want to like spill the beans, right? In a sense, right? You don't want to give away the meaning or squash that discussion. So I guess instead of asking you what you think the meaning is, because I assume you won't tell us, or maybe that the best answer is the one you just gave, right? The meaning is for you to be confused and to think about it. What do you think about? I know this is a long-winded question, but you touch on a lot of things, right? You touch on therapy and you touch on antidepressants and psychotic breaks, possibly, maybe not, right? Unreliable narration. You touch on politics and the election, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. So what do you think about that? Was that intentional? Was your goal to spur a bunch of discussions in a bunch of different realms? Were you kind of just messing around? What do you have an answer at all to that? I know that's kind of a convoluted, long-winded question, but what would you say to that?
um, I think it would be hard to give a really concrete answer to that question without saying, what I think is happening, and maybe that's a bad idea. I mean, I guess I would say one of the things I was thinking about when I was writing it was I'm a big fan of Albert Camus' writing, and I was thinking a lot about the famous opening sentence to The Stranger, where he says, "Mama died today," or maybe it was yesterday. I don't remember. Um, and I kind of based the style of the story around that. I mean, there are all these things that are happening around Merceau, and I mean, it's not so much that he doesn't understand them, but in a sense, he doesn't really care. Even during the trial, um, I've heard some people say that this is sort of a statement of maybe some mild form of autism or something, which I think kind of misses the point. But prosecutors are asking him, "Why did you shoot this person?" And his response is basically, "Because this person told me to." And it's kind of like a black hole of meaning, asking the question, why did he do what he did? Um, and there was a very famous answer that Camus gave to the question of why he wrote Marcel this way, and he said that maybe he isn't the Christ we want, but he's the Christ we deserve, or something like that. Which I've always wondered if it was an accident that they said pretty much the same thing at the end of The Dark Knight, and maybe not, because Christopher Nolan is a smart guy, but I don't know.
Yeah, a interesting answer, fitting with the piece, I have to say. I guess to move off of the meaning, because I think maybe we'll come back to it, but I think the best way to experience a piece like that is for people to discuss it on their own and to think about it. And I don't think, as you should, right? I don't think we're going to get too far in me being able to prod the answers away from you in this interview. So maybe instead, what do you think, like, would you tell us what inspired you without giving too much away, obviously, or like where was the like genesis for, like, where did the genesis for this piece come from? I know you said you were trying to confuse your audience or inspire something in them or force them to think or what have you, but was there a like a motivating event? Was there anything like that, or would that all just give too much away?
I don't think it would give too much away. I mean, I'd say the proximate cause for me writing it probably was kind of an experience of heartbreak. Experience of heartbreak. Um, I don't know if that really says anything about what's happening in the piece or not. I mean, it was just what was on my mind while I was writing it. And I guess to some degree, there's kind of an attempt to capture what I was feeling, because I think pretty much anything you write is an attempt to capture what you're feeling. Like, inevitably, uh, you're the one talking, even if you're writing a character. So um, I guess that's coming through in what I ended up writing.
Sure, absolutely. And then to kind of spin off of that, at least when I was reading it, like I enjoy reading lots of stuff that's kind of like complicated and strange. And I don't know, I read, like, if you've ever read House of Leaves by Danielewski, or like there's Wallace and Pynchon, as like anyone who like reads contemporary stuff probably knows, obviously. And like they all kind of work in this realm of like refusing to give you full answers, and refusing to write you like linear, clear narratives, and kind of using the experimental style to do new and different things. So were you inspired by like this style of writing? Were you like, who inspired you? Do you feel you're like working in the same vein? Do you reject that? What would you say about that, about like the literary influences on this piece?
I'm actually reading House of Leaves right now. Got it right here. So I hadn't read House of Leaves before. So actually, somebody recently recommended that I start reading it. I hadn't heard of Danielewski before then, but it was actually because I wrote a different piece that is kind of similar to House of Leaves. I mean, it's much shorter. It's just a short story, but it's kind of similar to House of Leaves and the way it uses footnotes and stuff. And David Foster Wallace did a lot of similar things. He liked writing footnotes on footnotes, but that's not really an answer to your question. I mean, I think the biggest influence on me was Camus. Um, and I don't know if anybody in particular really influenced the style at I mean, the end is like the most experimental piece. I guess really what I was trying to do was, um, in an earlier draft of it, I'd written an ending that was much more clear, and it really emphasized the P zombie, the philosophical zombie theme much more. But it was so confusing to people who read it that I just kind of axed it because, well, basically, people had a really tough time getting their head around what a philosophical zombie is and the implications of whether or not somebody might be one. Um, so instead, I decided to give no answers whatsoever and just make it. Um, it just sort of spins into the void, and the text at the end is just an element of everything breaking down.
Absolutely, and you cut in a little bit in and out right there, but I think it came through, so I think that'll be all right. Uh, yeah, absolutely right. Choosing to spin to the void instead of adding your other ending is what I heard. Do you care to share, like in a quick or brief way, if at all possible, what the original ending was that was even more confusing than the piece in its current iteration?
I mean, it was really only confusing in that people, even people who were kind of familiar with what a philosophical zombie was, didn't really wrap their head around what the implications of that are because um, they were. I think people weren't able to understand that if you're dealing with something that's physically identical to a person but not conscious, it would still act identically to a real person, and that includes speaking as if it were conscious. And that's kind of the creepy element of them. But the original ending included the main character having a final meeting with the psychologist, um, and she, uh, when she hears that he still isn't getting better, decides to start having sex with him. And in a very early draft, he actually kills her on the assumption that she is basically a philosophical zombie and can't experience any of it, so it doesn't matter. In the draft that came before, right before this one, they're having sex, and he has this realization that's supposed to supposed to imply that he actually is a philosophical zombie, and this whole time you've been getting the perspective of somebody who hasn't experienced anything whatsoever. Um, but nobody, either that didn't come through, or people didn't believe that something not conscious could write. Um, and uh, I wanted to be confusing, but not about what actually happened. So I just sort of axed that and did something else.
Sure. Yeah. That's interesting. So if we could hold on the point of philosophical zombie, right? Like as you say in the piece, the idea of a philosophical zombie is like a very famous thought experiment you will run into if you take any like 100 level philosophy of consciousness class or what have you, right? Which is basically imagine a person or thing, if you don't consider something without consciousness a person, that does not, that like functions, acts, talks, speaks, is indistinguishable from a regular conscious human as like you would see yourself, but is completely non-conscious, right? Like has no actual sense of self or understanding of its own actions, right? And then you say, right, which, as you say, right, like most people don't have a terribly difficult time wrapping their heads around what that would be like. But you said people tend to struggle with grappling with what the actual implications of that thought experiment are. Do you care to elaborate on that point? Like, what do you think the implications of that thought experiment are on the world, on the way we see each other, on our consciousness, on what it means, like anything, like what those implications that you were alluding to, what do you think they are?
Well, this is a rabbit hole, but it's a kind of one that I think is interesting. I think what people have a hard time getting their heads around if they don't have any philosophical training is the term physically indistinguishable because I mean consciousness is just so central to everything that we are that it's hard to imagine that something could be exactly like us if it didn't feel. And I guess people tend to think that a being that's not conscious would be kind of like a robot or a computer, which is kind of like us, and maybe you can pass the Turing test and fool us into thinking that it is a
And just
person.
and just real quick, sorry to cut you off, but sorry if you lose your train of thought. But the Turing test, real quickly, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Turing, the inventor of computers, whatever, said that like the test for what artificial intelligence truly is to be able to like basically be indistinguishable from a person, like if you're behind a screen or something. I believe, if I'm remembering that correctly. But basically, it's like a very simple test to if I'm talking to a human and I'm talking to some sort of artificial intelligence and I can't tell which is which, then that thing, quote unquote, passes the Turing test. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail you there, but if you would like to keep going.
Mhm. Yeah, well, we've had computers that could do that for a pretty long time now, and people are not very good at guessing whether a natural learning machine or a person is talking to them. Um, but there are plenty of ways you could know that that thing is not a person. I mean, it wouldn't be very good at like walking down the street, because it's just a box. But and so people kind of, I think something is lost when you say consciousness is the only thing that's not preserved between you and a physical copy of you. Um, but if you're living in a zombie world, you would have no idea. Really, there's no way you could know that. Um, and that's always been the most interesting implication of it to me because I've read some of the back and forth from, I mean, the two big players in this argument have always been, as far as I understand it, philosophers Daniel Dennett and David Chalmers go back and forth on this constantly about whether or not a philosophical zombie is even conceivable, whether it's possible, and whether you can know anything just by thinking about it. And it's always seemed very kind of bizarre and obscure to me that there's a very complicated argument over whether you could think about this thing, and because you can think about the thing, you could actually make one. And if you could make one, then it says something about what consciousness is. And that's too many leaps for me. I mean, I've always thought it's much more interesting as kind of an epistemological thought experiment about what you can know. Um, it's like as a counterfactual, I mean, you might be not conscious right now. I might be talking to something that isn't experiencing anything. I'd have no idea. And that's always been the more interesting implication of it to me, that there are certain things we have to assume to talk to other people. I mean, we could be wrong about literally everything. This might be a simulation. Um, and we have to assume that it's not, otherwise there's no point in doing anything really. And so that's the thing, the element of it that was more interesting in what I was talking about than the really technical, complicated arguments over whether you could think about this thing and what that would mean.
Right, like it is the thought experiment itself, like at a base level, right, gets very quickly to what you're saying, right? These underlying axiomatic presuppositions that like the things we have to assume are true in order for society as a whole to function, right? In order for us as individuals to function, right? Like we can't really grapple with the fact that there is absolutely no reason to believe that like everyone we talk to is conscious the way we are, except for the fact that like they look like us and we personally seem to experience consciousness, so they probably do, but there's no actual like hard and fast like mathematical proof that everyone else is conscious or even that you're conscious, right? So you just have to take it as like you have to assume that it's true, otherwise everything begins to break down, right? Like there is no like going to the bank or like talking to your family, right? Like it completely changes the fabric of what we think the world is. And as you said, right, like that's really it's quite an interesting thought experiment because it pushes you to really grapple with just how much you have to assume is true in order for like the world as you think it is constructed to function. Um, is that what you're going for? Do you did I completely misstate your premise, or would you like to like riff on that, or have we exhausted this rabbit hole?
I don't think you could ever exhaust this rabbit hole. It's too there's too much in it. I mean, it is interesting stuff, but I mean, even the really technical arguments over conceivability and what that means, that's interesting stuff, but it's not something that I think people reading a literary magazine are going to want to hear people talk about. But
You'd be
yeah, I think,
surprised. You'd be surprised by our audience. They get interested in the strangest things sometimes.
well, I mean, one of the examples that David Chalmers gives in this vein that's interesting to me is he distinguishes two different types of conceivability, and there's which I have a hard time wrapping my head around it a little bit, but primary and secondary conceivability. And he gives the example of water, and he says it's primarily conceivable that water, we could use the term water to refer to something else, like water could be a blanket or something. And then secondary conceivability is once we've defined what water means, then like define it as H2O, then it's not secondarily conceivable that water could be argon or something. Like if it's H2O, then it's not possible for it to be another element, another combination of elements. And then he applies this to the P zombie argument, and he talks about how depending on how we define consciousness, if we define it as a physical property, then it's not secondarily conceivable that a P zombie could exist. But if we define it otherwise, depending on what sort of property it is, then it could be that type of conceivable. And I've always thought that these kind of arguments are kind of funny because they don't tell you anything at all, because what they amount to is really a circular statement of, if consciousness is something that isn't created by something physical, then you could create something that is physically identical to a person but not conscious. And if it isn't, then you couldn't. And so the philosophical zombie arguments are basically circular. They just amount to what's called begging the question, which is saying, if the premise is true, then the conclusion will also be true. Or if the conclusion is one of its premises, then the conclusion will be true, which is not very helpful. But I don't know how much further you want to go down that rabbit hole. But
that's good. That's good. I think I know this is still, we're kind of down the philosophical rabbit hole, but I wonder what your take on so especially these kind of arguments, right? Like in philosophers and people with like grad student philosophers, and if you've ever taken philosophy class, right, there's a strong tendency to like run these thought experiments to these like kind of extreme conclusions, and to like push these arguments to almost like absurd places, and then attempt to defend them or construct them or prove this or that. And as you kind of said with I don't remember if that was Dennett or Chandler's argument, it doesn't matter, Chalmers' argument, but like with that argument, right, you've pushed it to such a place where it's begging the question, as you say, where you're not really getting anywhere. You've created this kind of tautological circle of where just like, if what I state, right, if my premise is true, then my conclusion must be true, or if my conclusion is in fact the premise, right? What do you think? Do you think there's, and I think the biggest criticism coming towards philosophy students and philosophy departments and people that like engage in this sort of thing is that like, in a lot of ways, it's intellectual masturbation, for lack of a better term. It's just kind of like spinning our wheels and seeing like what kind of solipsistic, or not solipsistic, sophistry we can create, and what kind of word games we can play to like try to do these things. So do you think there's value in these kinds of rabbit hole discussions, or is it more just like college student fun, or philosophy, like people with philosophy degrees like shooting the shit, drinking a couple of beers, you start talking about philosophical zombies, and this is where you kind of end up? Or do you think there's practical value to thinking about these things and engaging with these arguments at like the level of Dennett and like these kind of arguments?
I mean, I think that it depends on what you mean by practical, but I think there's value in it because it's interesting. I mean, you can kind of ask that question about all of academia. I mean, what's the point of studying like Egyptian history? there are no more ancient Egyptians, and so it's not very practical to study hieroglyphics. But one of the things that I think is interesting that's sort of a corollary to the philosophical zombie discussion is about what exactly it means to say that a person is themselves. I've always thought that's kind of an interesting place you could take it. I mean, for example, if I were physically identical to you, and I didn't, it's really even hard to talk. If I made a physical copy of you, and that thing was conscious, they'd both be experiencing two different things. And then the question of why that is kind of interesting, because because I guess it means there's something in addition to consciousness that makes you you. You're the one experiencing your consciousness, but you're also the physical collection of atoms that is you. And if I duplicate them, then what does it mean to talk about you as opposed to somebody else who's exactly like you? And we don't even really have good words to frame that. I'm not sure what you would call this other person, this like you 2.0 or something. But that's interesting corollary to me. Even if consciousness is preserved in physically duplicating you, you presumably wouldn't have access to the phenomenological experience of this other thing. And why is that? I mean, is it just because they're not literally the same atoms? And if that matters, then why does that matter? That's interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, and to reveal myself, I am in fact a undergrad. Like, I am a philosophy student. I am like, so I personally am on your side that these things are in fact valuable. And like being able to think about these things is in fact valuable. So I am not going to push you any further on that. And I do take your point about, like, I think your point about all of academia, right? Except maybe like the engineering department, right, kind of falls under this umbrella of, it's not blatantly obvious to like what exactly we're adding to the world by doing these kinds of things, but I think there is value there.
Yeah, I could give you an example
Yeah.
that I think would help, like why this is good to think about. I mean, at some point we're going to get to the point technologically where we could do something like try to upload your brain to a computer. And at that point, it's going to be really important to think about the question of what are you uploading? Because it's definitely possible that all you're doing is copying your brain. And that's going to be a very different experience for you. Did I cut out? Am I still?
Nope, you're good. You're good.
I'm good? Okay. Well, it would be a very different experience for you to be copied than it would to actually have your brain uploaded, because in the first case, if I copy my brain and then I die, I'm just dead. And then there's something else out there that looks and talks exactly like me. But I'm not experiencing it. Copy this person's brain. I think you'd successfully uploaded it. And you really can't. There's no way to know.
Yeah, you cut out there a little bit at the end, but I think enough of it came through, right? Like this idea, right? Technology is clearly trending towards the point where we're going to be able to upload our brains or our quote unquote consciousnesses to like some virtual space. And at that point, right, then this question of where is the locus of consciousness? Is a direct copy of your brain the same thing as you? Are we going to end up with two yous, right? This you and UV2 that you don't experience the same. All of a sudden, this question becomes very, very pertinent, because obviously you don't want to be uploading yourself to a computer when you're not uploading all of yourself or what have you, right? So there's a direct, right? Like, that's why these kind of seemingly absurdist questions at some points, right, like often do have direct impacts on, like, right, all of a sudden, right, with one technological leap, we have reached a point where like this is one of the most important questions to be like trying to figure out an answer to. So I take your defense of philosophy as extremely valid, and I, again, am a personal believer that this is a valuable thing to be doing. Hence why I have asked us to dive down this rabbit hole of philosophical zombies.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, to jump back to the piece, here's an interesting question, right? You said you've possibly, right? But you said you kind of wrote this for a creative writing class or something at some point, and you were clearly running it by people, and they said like, "Oh, I'm like confused," or I was confused, but not in the way you intended me to be confused, right? So I guess my question to you is for other young writers or people in undergrad in creative writing programs or what have you who are writing in this space, right? This kind of experimental space, choosing to confuse their audience, writing things that are cryptic or hard to understand. I can imagine that you can get a lot of pushback to like not do that, to dumb your story down for lack of a better way, or make it more understandable, or kind of like change the creative process. What do you say to that? Do you like, how do you differentiate good, valuable critique from like someone who just doesn't quite want to grapple with things that are different?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to have to decide whether you think uh, criticism or comment is useful. So, I mean, the only really important adjudicator of whether or not what somebody said about your piece is good or not is going to be you, because you're going to be the one writing it. And I mean, a lot of the time, people's responses to what you've written are going to be filtered through the lens of their way of writing, because as much as we want to make writing a science, it really is more of an art. And so if somebody's suggesting you change what you wrote, you're going to have to be the one doing it. And if it's not the way that you write, then you can't really adopt somebody else's perspective. You're stuck inside of your writing perspective. But I mean, there is a level of confusion that's useful and a level of confusion that's not. That's why when people tell you, when you give them a piece, that they were confused, people's first response as a writer is, I need to make this clearer, because what you don't want to be confusing is what actually happened. I mean, sometimes you do, but generally you want the person reading your story to understand the flow of events, because otherwise they're going to get bored. What it's okay for people to be confused about is what it means or what you were trying to get at. That's perfectly fine. But I mean, that's what I was trying to do. But it's generally not super useful for you to write a story where the connection, just the basic connection of events from point A to point B, is lost. I mean, some writers have decided that's a good idea, like Finnegan's Wake, for example, is that kind of piece. I mean, it's not even really written in English, and I mean, to me, that's kind of going too far, because I think he spent like 15 years writing this, and it's written in like a combination of English and Hindi and Hebrew and all sorts of different languages. And unless you have a PhD in linguistics, you're not going to be able to read it. I mean, there have been people out there who spent like their whole lives writing master's theses on Finnegan's Wake and trying to pull it apart. But to me, that's not as interesting. I do actually find Finnegan's Wake very interesting just as a concept, but it's not the kind of book I'd want to sit down and just read, because I would have no idea what the hell was happening.
I don't
Daniel
think there's,
Lusky.
yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find the person who like comes home after a long day of work and is like, you know what, just gonna take a load off. I think I'll sit down and read Finnegan's Wake. Like, I don't think that person exists.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. But also, even if you know a lot, like even if you're the kind of person who reads literature, like hard literature, you're not going to want to read it, because I mean, it's not even really English. It's considered an English novel, but he invented his own language. And I mean, I could invent my own language and write a book, but nobody's going to want to read that, because I'm not James Joyce. But I'm not sure how valuable. It was an interesting experiment, and it inspired a lot of different things. But I don't know how much it would have inspired if he wasn't James Joyce and didn't have the stature that he already did. Maybe if I wrote Ulysses first, then I could write Finnegan's Wake.
Absolutely. You were gonna say something about Daniel Lusky. Do you want to finish that thought? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Well, I mean, he didn't write the same way. Like, you can understand what's going on with Danielewski, even if the writing is bizarre and fractured. It takes a lot of work, but it's written in a comprehensible language. And I think there's kind of a difference, because even if you do the work, you can understand what's going on. But also, part of what he was doing was or at least what he was, a lot of the critics Danielewski have said is of academic criticism. And I guess to some degree, reflecting on what I did, I'm doing something similar, because I was talking about how I kind of think of the philosophical zombie argument as too technical and complicated. And to some degree, there's kind of an element of satire in what I was doing with what I wrote, in just trying to represent how absurd kind of argument can become.
Oh, we're having a little bit of a connection issue. Can you hear me still?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think we got it back. I think we got most of that. You kind of cut out at the end there, when you switched to your piece. I believe. Let me know if I missed it. But I think what you were saying, right, was that your piece was almost a right, like satire, as you said, of the entire philosophical zombie argument, and how technical it can get, and kind of how absurd it can become. Was that right, or did I miss you because of technical difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that in what I was doing.
Great. And we're running a little short on time, so I will have to end with the cliche of cliche questions for writer interviews, which is, if you're talking to someone who loves to read, or maybe someone who wants to become a writer, what books would you recommend to them? 2, 3, 10, 50, however many books spring to mind. What would you recommend?
I mean, that's always a weird question, because it really depends on what kind of writer you want to be. But I do believe in Slaughterhouse-Five, at one point, Vonnegut says, everything you need to know about the world is contained in the Brothers Karamazov. And directly after that, what he said was, but that's not enough anymore. But I think the first half of that is right. That's my favorite book. And if you want to know pretty much everything there is to know about being a person, you should read that book. And like a lot of Dostoevsky's other books, there are many subplots that are a little bit frustrating to try and follow, because Russian novels have a million characters and it's hard to remember who everybody is. But there are certain sections of it that make it worth trying to follow what's going on. And I could probably talk about that book for at least another hour, but I think the scene between Ivan and Alyosha in the bar, and that whole conversation, might be one of the best things anybody's ever written. So if you try and follow any of, at least try and follow that conversation.
And that would be the part where, right, without trying to spoil the plot, they're discussing like morality and religion, and like how to justify evil, like how to justify God in a world where there's evil. And it spins into Ivan's telling of the Grand Inquisitor, which is like one of the most famous chapters of any book ever written in all of literature, which is saying something, even by Dostoevsky standards. And I have to concur with everything you've said. I think the Brothers Karamazov is fantastic, and I too, that is my favorite part of the book. Those handful of chapters right there, where they're laying out where Ivan is laying out his philosophical positions, basically, about the world. And what book was written 150 something odd years ago, and it's still unbelievably relevant and dense, and will change your whole outlook, I think, if you take the time to really try to dive into those arguments that Dostoevsky is presenting.
Yeah, I have as my lock screen on my phone a quote from that book, which is just one sentence, but it's like half a page because that's how he writes. But it's this is Ivan saying this in that conversation. He said, "I believe like a child that suffering will be healed and made up for, and all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all the crimes of humanity, for all the blood they've shed, that it will make it not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened with men." Which is one sentence, but that I think that's yeah, I think that's the best sentence anybody's ever written.
There we
If I
go.
had to
And
have a candidate.
so I think there's no better place to end than with a quote from Dostoevsky. So I think we'll end it there. Jacob, it's been great. Your piece is super interesting. I encourage everyone to discuss it, to grapple with it, to take whatever they can take from it. And I hope we can have you on again. I hope to see more of you.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.